Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again as we get started on this section, AWS Global Infrastructure. So this is where we're going to get introduced to various topics, including regions, what availability zones are, what data centers are. But before we start talking about all those wires and how they get connected, let's talk about who AWS is. Amazon Web Services was launched in 2006, so it's been about 14 years now. So that just tells us that cloud is already a decade old, yeah? Today it's 2020 and Amazon has over 200 services providing a range of services from network, compute, storage, databases, developer tools. I mean, I can go on, but this is just to tell you that Amazon has got everything that you need under the sun as far as technology is concerned. You can think about blockchain, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, serverless computing, Kubernetes. Amazon has got everything. And we'll get to know about those as we get along through the course. So instead of starting this lesson by telling you what services Amazon Web Services offers, let's fly 30,000 feet above the ground and look at how Amazon looks from the sky. So the Amazon Web Services global infrastructure has 22 regions as on today. So the AWS global infrastructure has 22 regions around the world with 70 availability zones. We're going to talk about availability zones in here in just a couple of minutes, but let's understand and look at how the regions looks like. I've pulled up a website from Amazon Web Services, which is infrastructure.aws. So you can go here as well and take a look at the latest footprint of Amazon Web Services across the planet. So all of these orange boxes that you see is nothing but AWS Global Infrastructure Map, which represents regions, okay? So all of these are regions. That also includes the physical location where they are physically located. At the highest level, AWS physical infrastructure is made up of numerous regions, as you see. So you got some of them in North California in the West Coast. On the East Coast, there's North Virginia. You got a lot of these data centers in the European region as well. Few of them in the Middle East. There's one in India. There's one in South Africa coming up. There's a lot of them in the Southeast Asian region and Australia as well. The one thing to keep in mind is that every region has multiple availability zones. Okay, so let's understand that by clicking on a particular region. So what I'm going to do is click on Sao Paulo, let's say. All right, it's going to zoom in right there. And what it tells me is that there are three availability zones. Now, these three little dots, the three little blue dots, are nothing but availability zones, and you're going to find such availability zones in every region. Okay, so let's do that for North Virginia. So I'm going to go back up, close that, and then let's say click on Frankfurt for that matter. And what do we have here? You got three availability zones in Frankfurt. So when you're playing around this world map, you can scroll to the right as well and to the left as well with your mouse, and then get that first-hand experience with this wonderful interactive display of Amazon's data center. So now I'm going to click on this North Virginia, and what I have here is six availability zones, the highest so far, isn't it? But what is an availability zone? Availability zones are where your actual AWS resources are located. So let's take a look at this hierarchy one more time. So you got all of these multiple regions, okay? All of these orange boxes that you see are nothing but regions, but then you got availability zones inside the regions, okay? So every region will have minimum two, but may also have three or more availability zones within them. So that's our region. The orange box is our region, and then there are data centers within that region, and we call them as availability zones. Now what I'm going to do is just focus on one particular region here, let's say North Virginia, okay? I usually pick up North Virginia because this is considered to be the guinea pig for Amazon, so they do lots of testing and new features are introduced in this region. So this region here has six availability zones. So what's inside each availability zone? Now each availability zone is a data center, or it could also have more than one data center within that availability zone. So when you're provisioning resources in North Virginia, it's going into one of these blue boxes. It's going into one of those availability zones, okay? So remember that inside the region, you got availability zones, and inside the availability zones, you got one or more data centers where your AWS resources will reside. So I'm going to scroll in a little bit here, and then what you see is the blue box. I cannot go any further than this. So just imagine this as a huge data center, okay, where you will have your virtual machines or databases sitting inside that. Okay, so this map is pretty cool map that puts all of the AWS components together, and you can see that it shows your resources that exist within AWS. So these orange boxes represent where AWS exists as on today around the world. This is a pretty interactive map, so you can go ahead and click on these individual components, and it's going to tell you what the definition of availability zones is, what a data center is, and what it comprises of, what a region is. So you can go ahead and click on these interactive map and play around to get that first-hand experience. You may be already thinking about this. What is the need for an availability zone, isn't it? So previously we learned about these concepts called as high availability and fault tolerance. Remember? So those were our definitions or terms that we learned previously in the other lessons. Availability zones fulfill the needs of high availability and fault tolerance. Availability zones have low latency connections between each other. Each availability zone is isolated from each other, and there could be hundreds of miles apart. But remember that these data centers or these availability zones within that region are connected to each other with low latency links. All right, so these blue dots may be 100 miles apart, but they are connected with high speed connections. So the low latency just means that it's a fast connection between the sites, and there is not a lot of delay or lag when traffic is sent between the availability zones. So that was about availability zones. Now, what's this pink color doing here? What is this pink dot? Now, these pink circles represent points of presence. Points of presence are also called as edge locations, and these are geographically located all around the world. Now, I'll just close this pop-up and let you see the world map where all these pink dots are located. Now you'll see that there are more pink dots or more point of presence locations than regions or availability zones. Now, these POPs or points of presence are essentially what we call as edge locations, where AWS uses these locations to replicate certain data and certain services. So think about an application that is doing the content delivery networks for your CDN. So in AWS, we call it as CloudFront. We'll talk about CloudFront much later in the course, but think about how you're going to access a web page. No matter where you are in the world, you want that web page to load up quickly. So these point of presence or the edge locations will be responsible to cache that web page in the location that is nearest to you, so that those images pop up fast on your desktop and all the desktops of all the users accessing that web application. So AWS uses their global network and these points of presence to replicate that data in those applications all around the world. And then that ways, everybody is able to get access to the data quickly. And again, that's an oversimplification of what CloudFront can do, but that is just to give you an idea of what CloudFront is, what CDN is, and how these points of presence are utilized. I'm going to move on to the next point now, which is networks. So all of these white lines that you see connecting between the regions are the networks, right? So these are dotted lines that represent the AWS networks. So these networks connect the regions and they also connect the availability zones together. They are fast networks and they are also running through the oceans that run across the ground under the ocean to link the regions that are located in different parts of the world. Think about the fact that somebody went underwater for you and laid cable so that the networks could communicate with each other at various places around the world. We're not going to cover how they laid the cables underwater and how things are getting connected with this data center, but these facts are just good to know. So far we talked about regions and then we talked about availability zones and how the availability zones are able to replicate the data between them for high availability. Remember that this high availability is not always automatic. There are certain services that do replicate data between different availability zones automatically, but there are others where you are responsible because you provision them. You are the architect and you design the environment correctly to create that high availability across availability zones and across regions. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next piece here, which is the data center. So inside our availability zone, we have one or more data centers. So this is where the resources are hosted. So these are all combination of physical servers, storage, compute, and everything that falls under the network category, like firewalls, switches, and security components as well. So all of these equipment, the physical ones, they're all located inside the AWS data centers. So when we create our virtual machines or virtual resources, they reside in one of these data centers. So in reality, there's a physical server, but in actual, we are creating virtual resources like a virtual machine or even a virtual storage. The interesting concept is that if the hardware behind the virtual machine starts to fail, we could move that virtual server to a new piece of hardware. And that's one of the advantages of virtualization. But even though you're moving it from one hardware to another, they are still residing inside the same AWS data centers. And then it can be replicated as well across geographies. This is done because the different data centers communicate with each other. You can go ahead and provision the resources closest to the users who are using them. So let's say you got your customers and users located in Australia. What you're going to do is go ahead and create that virtual machine in one of the Australian data centers, right? Somewhere in Sydney. So if you got users in America, you could do the same thing, right? So you create resources in the regions that are closest to the users. And you got to make sure that you deploy your resource in multiple availability zones so that you got your infrastructure as fault tolerant and highly available. But that doesn't mean that something can never go wrong, okay? At times you may want to keep your high availability across geographies as well. Do not rely on fault tolerance and availability for a single geographical region. So think about if you need to separate data for high availability in different parts of the world. So you got your office somewhere sitting in Frankfurt, and then you got your office somewhere in Northern California, let's say. So you can actually replicate that data between the AWS regions across the AWS network. So look at the dotted lines there that represent the network itself. So your data is going to go all the way through the wire under the ocean back and forth between Frankfurt and Northern California. So you have the ability, based on your application and what your applications can do, you can go ahead and keep your applications highly available within the region as well as between the regions. So as you see, Amazon has got lots of benefits to offer. So what I'm going to give you is a small homework here. Go ahead and navigate to this website, infrastructure.aws. And before you start running the next lesson in this course, go ahead and play around these buttons, read a little bit, understand how AWS infrastructure is nicely spread out across the geographies and what these individual points have to say. There is no point in me reading these little paragraphs and little dots here because you can go ahead and read this yourself and you may find some interesting points here. So that's all for now, folks. In this lesson, we learned about how Amazon Web Services data centers are spread across geographies, how Amazon is ensuring high availability and fault tolerance with the help of availability zones, caching the data in the point of presence, and how quickly they can transmit the data back and forth between the availability zones and between the regions with the help of super fast networks that they have laid down for us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.